Very interesting talk. And now our final speaker is David Knuti, who has been an observer of Russia, the former Soviet Union, and international energy issues for over 25 years in various professional capacities. He's especially knowledgeable on Russian energy issues and the development of the oil and gas production of the Caspian region. As a CIA analyst, he worked in the 1990s on the emergence of Caspian energy developments from a low-priority backwater of Soviet industry to a key resource for U.S. energy security. He was a key analyst of the major production developments in Baku, Azerbaijan, and the North Caspian Kazakhstan zones, as well as the diplomatic efforts to advance the Caspian Pipeline Consortium and Baku-Ceyhan oil pipelines from the region. Moving to the Commerce Department in 1996, he supported U.S. diplomatic efforts to positively influence energy development as part of the U.S. delegations traveling to Turkey and the Caspian region to meet with heads of government and company executives. He ended his career with the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service on 3-year assignments in the Moscow and Budapest embassies, where he worked with foreign governments to facilitate energy policy reform and U.S. company investments. Since retiring in 2005 to Madison, Wisconsin, Mr. Knuti has maintained his expertise on these issues and given lectures at the University of Wisconsin, local colleges, and civic groups. His current priority is to raise awareness concerning the limits of future oil and gas resources as part of the Madison Peak Oil Group. He holds a master's degree from Soviet and Eastern Studies here at Kansas and is a graduate of the Defense Language Institute Russian course. So help us welcome our final speaker.
Well, that was quite a tour de force of the perimeter, and I'm going to deal with the same area. I will let's see if I can get this thing up here. Well, thanks for the introduction, and I'm going to skip my background, which was very nice and perhaps charitably inflated. But nevertheless, I'd like to particularly make a plug for the study of geography here at KU, and particularly before that in the whole program. But Leslie Venus is a really a widely respected authority on this whole area that I'm going to talk about in the former Soviet Union. And when I was at KU, he had just completed work on the Atlas of Soviet Petroleum, and this was a CIA product, and he had a great following at the agency, and being his student was a great step up, and I think he actually gave me a recommendation that was pivotal in getting hired. But all through my career, this training in geography was very important to my own work I did, and getting hired as well, but also to be able to function in a wide range of activities that were not specifically geography, but in which geography was very much the substance. And this went to political analysis, but also in later parts economic analysis, and also commercial work following that, promoting U.S. business. And it's all one, it all has merged into a continuing process. I'd like to talk today about the work I did and the experience I had and the feelings I have about the Caspian energy area And I had the privilege of working in the Soviet Analysis Division at the CIA at the time when they discovered the Soviet republics. This was very late in the game. They didn't form a branch to discuss this until 1989, and all of a sudden these republics appeared out of nowhere. I ended up working on Central Asia. Well, the Central Asia and the Caucasus, and really the really most interesting issue was the emergence of the Caspian as a very important energy area, and the role of the United States government supporting the United States government in developing these Caspian resources. It turned a little known but very important U.S. foreign policy triumph. And I worked in particularly looking at a number of areas as the Tengiz contract in Kazakhstan and Baku, and the pipelines were developed, and I'll go into those as kind of like case studies. And then after that, I was able to go to the Caucasus, in Turkey and Caucasus region with the Commerce Department, which was at that point very much involved in the commercial and economic, diplomatic development or promotion of the U.S. point of view in that area at that time, something you don't expect. A very good source for this that anybody who's interested in following up on it is a great book, Steve Levine, The Oil and the Glory. My perspective was from a corner of the process and at the early stage, but Steve Levine takes it all the way through to the end and has a great inside view if you want to study a economic and geopolitical situation. That's very good. And as this emerges, the U.S. Energy Information Agency has great profiles of Kazakhstan and Central Asia to study as oil and hydrocarbon areas. The interesting thing about the Caspian is I think in our field, you look at these areas as regions, political regions that have political life, and they all sort of end at the Caspian. The Caspian is a big hole. So on the one hand, you have the Caspian, in a sense, is the south. It's the end of Russia. Over here in Dagestan, and of course off here into the region of the Caucasus. It's also the western border of the Caucasus states, Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia. It's the eastern boundary, pardon me, it's the eastern boundary of the Caucasus. It's the western boundary of Kazakhstan, and that means the boundary of Central Asia, the boundary of Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, the eastern boundary of Central Asia. And it's the northern boundary of Iran, and in a sense the whole South Asian world, including Afghanistan. So we tend to look at these areas as being central areas of politics, but one of the things that has happened in the late 20th century and just emerged as I was involved in the government was the Caspian as a major energy region, and the Caspian became, in effect, a region worthy of intense study, and the interactions of it, the borders within it, the various possibilities for crossing it from here to here, from Turkmenistan to Azerbaijan, from up here in northern Kazakhstan. All these connections and interactions and interpolitics become very important. And I think that there's also an aspect of this which is rarely mentioned, and that's we talked this morning about the market for these kind of jobs is also in the area of energy security. And I think that it would be an important area to think about here at KU to emphasize this kind of study as something that would be interested not only to mid-career professionals in the energy fields or in government, but as a worthy area for research, an energy-centered, energy security-centered approach to this region. what makes the Caspian a major energy region. The current production is about 3.4 million barrels of oil a day, a production which is quite approaching the United States. But the further potential of the region is to double this by 1215 if technical, organizational, and transportation challenges are met. And this compares with roughly 5.3 or whatever it's now in the United States, bumping up a little bit, but not going to change a whole lot. If this becomes 7 billion barrels a day, which is the currency or the numerical unit of oil production, one we all should be aware of, it compares with roughly would be comparison with the U.S. and also would be half of Saudi Arabia or Russia, and about the level of the North Sea, a extremely important energy increment to the world. In addition to that, Caspian gas is also a very strong factor, and many of the deposits there are very heavy with gas, about 5% of the world's reserves. Compare that, let's see, I think the figure which I eliminated is 300 trillion square feet of gas coming in T's, trillion square feet, more than the U.S., about a third of Russia, and a very significant amount, but again, dependent on further development. The areas that we have to look at, the areas that we all should be familiar with, going around the Caspian, the old area of Baku, the leading oil production area around the turn of the century, and then in a long eclipse, now in a major redevelopment with Western companies, a sort of mid-sized area, but very significant. And then we go up north into Kazakhstan, really a whole series of supergiant areas that in the United States, we don't have any more of these left. This is the largest unexploited or underexploited hydrocarbon resource area in the world. And so it's composed of these major developments, which will be the subject of some of my experiences along the line. The Tengiz project, which was developed initially by Chevron and was with great support by the U.S. government, and the area up to the north, Karachaganak, an older field, but also a very important field. Both of these could be classified as supergiants. If you think of a giant field being a billion in reserves, a billion barrels of oil in reserve, these are fields that have 6+ billion barrels of oil. But the biggest of all, the granddaddy of all, is the Karachaganak, or the Kashagan field, offshore in the Caspian here, underdeveloped, has not produced any oil yet, but is said to be the largest oil field outside of Saudi Arabia in the world, the largest single oil field. So these are areas of tremendous importance, and their geographic location is extremely important because how do you get them out? How do you get the production out? Turkmenistan, also an area of large gas deposits, some oil, and the gas is an important feature of the whole picture. The thing about the Caspian is, and it's a strange phenomenon of being buried deep in the Eurasian landmass, a landlocked lake about 700 miles long, essentially an empty spot in most people's up to this point. But here it is in the center of not just any center, it's in the middle, I think of it in the middle of nowhere, but connected, potentially connected everywhere. And so this particular map shows connections that could run up through the Russian pipeline system up to the Baltic, or through the mainline system to Europe. The pipelines outside, possible pipelines, a pipeline that was eventually constructed through the Black Sea and out through the Bosporus. Another pipeline possibility, which was constructed finally through the Caucasus, but also with potential for a shipment through Iran and shipment all the way to China. So it's at the center of the distant center, but at the center of many of the world's major oil-producing or oil-consuming areas. The pipeline system that was developed in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, was initially this pipeline from Tengiz over to the Black Sea coast, and then again out the Bosporus, and then the other pipeline up from Baku through Turkey to Ceyhan at the Mediterranean. And the development of these pipelines was extremely difficult and time-consuming, and a great triumph. The essential point is that reaching the blue water ocean, the Mediterranean, has to come through this connection through the Bosporus, through Turkey, which greatly limits the amount of oil that can be mobilized and shipped through these pipelines ending at the Black Sea. So the drama of trying to get through these multiple borders and long path to the Mediterranean with this pipeline from Baku, both successful ventures, but unfinished, because the total production of this area, as it materializes, there won't be an additional 3.5 billion barrels of oil produced unless there is a way to either increase these capacities or provide a bypass of the Bosporus. So this effort to design pipeline connections continues to this day with multiple hypothetical path lines around this Bosporus connection. You can see that China is connected, and Kazakhstan is a major key for China's energy supply in the Far East in Xinjiang. And these pipelines that are currently being developed, connecting existing pipelines to hook up to the energy coming out of the Caspian, are now coming away all the way across to China. And the first lines have been completed here, joining existing systems, and there is an existing pipeline not bringing Caspian oil, but beginning to bring oil to far western China from Kazakhstan. And also, Turkmenistan is a potential energy source for Afghanistan, transiting Afghanistan and into the very much energy short areas of Pakistan and India. So essentially, in all directions, the Caspian is a important potential energy source. Unfortunately, in every direction, it's about 1,000 miles, or it's traveling through some kind of narrow bottleneck like the Bosporus, or across hostile borders. How did we get involved in this? There was a lot of talk about the U.S. Being involved in oil wars, hostage our foreign policy to oil. In this case, I think that it's pretty clear that we got involved essentially as an effort to sort out the former Soviet Union, to sort out to have a fruitful ending of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And particularly in the early days, we wanted to help Gorbachev, very much on our minds, to bring the Soviet economy to a new course. And we didn't have any idea how much of a crash that was going to occur, but we saw oil as the basis of making this transition, and we wanted to make to get this process going with a kind of a deal that U.S. companies could accept. And the one that they could accept turned out to be in Kazakhstan, the Tengiz deposit. So if U.S. companies could make a profitable deal, the U.S. government is in the business of supporting U.S. companies. Chevron, and particularly Chevron being a capable company, it was also turned into the flagship of this effort to bring Western involvement and Western investment to Russia, essentially. But then the collapse collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Kazakhstan asserted its claim to this deposit. So if there were to be new states, and if the U.S. government was to be involved, then we would support the stability and the independence of the newly independent states. This was my own experience inside the government at this point. I mean, I'm giving you my take on what our motives were as I experienced them, and certainly the breakup of the Soviet Union as of 1989 or 88 was not the objective of the United States. There was a great debate as to whether it was possible to save the Soviet Union, but there was many people who felt that it might be the best thing to save them as a dialogue and interlocutor on arms control and as a guarantor of stability over this vast region. But as it turned out, the Soviet Union did come apart, and we certainly were prepared when it did to support the newly independent states. I mentioned Turkey. Another important driver of our interest in the Caspian area and developing Caspian resources was Turkey. And Turkey then and now is always a real central point of U.S. policy. It is always seen as our bastion of stability in the Middle East. Now it has a little different flavor to it, but I think the same kind of attitude would prevail in the government. And Turkey was also, at that point, seen as part of the Clinton administration's emerging market strategy. So we were very much involved in reaching out to these markets like Russia and like Turkey and like India, China for that matter, that were emerging in the 1990s. So we wanted to see Turkey succeed, and we were particularly interested in getting energy for Turkey, and the energy supplies that were potentially coming into view from the Caspian would be a great benefit to the Turks. But particularly, we didn't want them to be solving their energy problems through Iran. And Iran was proposing some rather large energy gas deals, and Turkey was very short of gas, and we were very much jawboning the Caspian as an alternative source of their energy supply. One of the first missions I ever went on was with Secretary Daley, and here we are. I was part of this delegation which signed a commercial protocol between our Commerce Secretary and their Commerce Secretary. But it's interesting, the subjects of them, they included power plants in Turkey, a rather massive construction program with new power plants, effort to bring Caspian gas to the area and consider Turkey's desire for pipelines, and also part of the negotiations and the discussion was sympathy for the Bosporus and the Turkish concerns for the Bosporus. And essentially, very much on our mind at that point was the fact that this channel in which all this oil might eventually come had to come through this 50-mile or so waterway, which went right through the middle of Istanbul, and its narrowest point was a commercial, just a little bit wide. And we had a great deal to do with the great concern about that. Very much a key issue for the Turks and very much a driver for our policy. Of course, striving to contain Iran, very much on our mind, always on our mind. And, but on the other hand, many of the companies were willing to consider that and willing to consider their as a viable alternative. Iran had a very intriguing possibility of swapping Caspian oil for their oil at the Persian Gulf. North Iran is actually an oil and energy deficit area, and the Caspian would have a ready energy market if we were ever to have a new bargain with Iran. So the trick of all this was keeping Russia both cooperative and at bay. And we went to work, I think, trying to encourage reform, and at the same time trying to make available a open system of transportation out of the Caspian. And this is sort of the dialogue in politics. Should we be offending Russia, or should we be serving the company interests and our energy interests in transiting around Russia? Is Putin a hold-up man? Is Russia a hold-up man? I don't think so. They had a lot of reasons, a lot of great fears about their energy system coming apart. But essentially it was a non-starter for the companies to use this energy system. It was poorly organized, well, not poorly organized, but organized on a monopoly basis, and would have involved all kinds of submergence in Russian political interests if it had been used. Nevertheless, it was available and held out a cheaper alternative to going through alternative pipelines. Finally, as these other factors, as the exploration of the Caspian went forward, we came to see that the whole Caspian area, as the exploration opened up, it finally became apparent that this was a potential North Sea area, and that the U.S. government should take this very seriously as an alternative and for the future. The agencies that led the effort on the Caspian was essentially somewhat a different group than normally involved. Not a military leadership, but essentially Bush and Clinton and Gore trying to make peace with Russia, trying to have cooperation with Russia, trying to strengthen peacefully these independent states, but also groups in the National Security Council which saw the potential of the Caspian region for energy purposes and for political purposes, and the Energy Department, which was waking up to how important this was to our energy interests, and finally Commerce, a guy named Jan Kalitsky, who was indefatigable in promoting these kind of alternative approaches, and of course the CIA, which was tracking the whole thing, trying to support them, trying to support this whole effort in a way which was not related to geopolitical conflict, but related to kind of commercial, political, geopolitical development. I guess there's not much time to go through these, but I'll just make a brief mention of some of the very interesting areas in which I was involved, and which were stepping stones along the way. And one of the first things was the great contract for Tengiz. This was when finally this huge deposit on the Caspian coast was revealed as a supergiant. The U.S. and the Soviets revealed their geological information the oil companies suddenly became extremely interested in it. And one of the, there was a rivalry between BP and Chevron for the leadership of this thing. It was interesting that a very colorful guy named Jim Giffen was the promoter of this idea originally with Gorbachev. He promoted a grand scheme for U.S. Companies to become involved in Russia, and the kingpin of that was to be this Tengiz contract with Chevron. That collapsed when the Soviet Union fell, but it was very important that this guy Giffen sold both Gorbachev and Chevron on the idea. Giffen was very much a correspondent with the agency. He was both a manipulator and a valuable source, but also a manipulator of the government through his reporting. And that was one of the things that I had the opportunity to do, was to interview him many times for his information. Helping Chevron untangle the pipeline tangle, a big controversy over who would develop this pipeline, a very major struggle for several years, and finally this Giffen guy on the other side, working for the Kazakhs and U.S. diplomacy, were able to untangle it. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium was done. The deal at Baku was done. Pushing it over the end was a specific show of support from Clinton, organized by the National Security Council. A lot of jawboning to Azerbaijan to get the deal done and do it with Western companies, despite of what the Russians were threatening. Finally, the approach of multiple pipelines, something that the United States government formulated into a slogan and pushed the fact that it wasn't satisfactory to just use Russia. It wasn't satisfactory to just go through the Bosporus. We had to have these multiple alternatives. And one of my projects was to create this map, which showed all the alternatives. You can see that there were quite a few of them, and quite a few of different kinds of tracking. And again, using geographical knowledge to produce these maps in very short order was kind of the specialty that I had. And then finally promoting the pipeline to Baku. Being in Georgia at the end of the first phase of this first successful phase, there we are meeting with people all day long, every day on these missions. There I am sitting at the first pipeline that came from Baku, the so-called early oil pipeline. That's the only time I ever saw a pipeline. And I never saw a drop go through it, but there was the end of it. Here's our Georgian Toastmaster there, and multiple toasts celebrating the pipeline. Just in conclusion, I would say that there's a lot of unfinished business in the Caspian. It's very worthy of our efforts, and I would hope that we would be an active participant in solving these continuing problems, because that 3 or 4 or 5 billion gallons of oil is a crucial next increment to avoiding a real ceiling on oil production in the world, an imminent ceiling on oil production, a peak oil moment.